Defies saw her standing alone beneath the chandeliers, where light fractured itself into 1,000 cruel reflections, each one eager to betray her. The ballroom of Ashcombe House was swollen with perfume and expectation, silk brushing silk like whispered judgments, and yet around her there lay a small, deliberate emptiness. It was not accident but design. Society possessed a talent for such arrangements, seating disgrace where it could be properly observed. Miss Eleanor Hartwell held her spine straight as if dignity were a visible armor. She had been announced late, her name carried too loudly by the footman who misjudged the room's appetite for her presence. A pause followed, thick and uncomfortable, before conversation resumed at a higher pitch, as though her arrival were a regrettable interruption. Eleanor did not flinch. She had learned, in drawing rooms and diminished parlors, that survival required stillness. Tonight was meant to be her beginning. That promise had been stitched carefully into her gloves as she dressed, folded into the worn corners of a mother's smile, carried like a fragile relic across the city in a rattling carriage. A favorable introduction, a single dance, perhaps even a conversation unburdened by pity, such modest hopes, and yet the room seemed determined to grind them into powder. Fans fluttered nearby. Names were exchanged. Eleanor heard her own spoken softly, not to her, but about her. The phrases were polished, rehearsed, unfortunate circumstances, admirable composure, a pity about the family. It was understood that her father's debts had outlived him, and that her beauty, though undeniable, was now considered an inconvenience rather than a currency. She was a woman of 24 with no fortune and a future discussed as though it were already settled. She stood near a marble column, hands folded, gaze directed just above the heads of the crowd. From there she could see the orchestra poised like obedient shadows, bows lifted but waiting, as if even the music hesitated to include her. Chandeliers burned overhead, their heat pressing down, making the air heavy with breath and judgment. Eleanor felt herself shrinking beneath it, not in posture, but in possibility. Someone laughed too loudly behind her. Another voice murmured, was she truly invited? Eleanor felt the words strike her back like cold rain. She remembered other rooms, smaller and kinder, where her laughter had once filled space without apology. Those rooms belonged to a past that no longer answered when summoned. All evening, one absence was remarked upon with growing irritation. The Duke of Ravensmere had not yet arrived. His delay became a subject of theatrical concern, a diversion that briefly displaced Eleanor from the center of scrutiny. Ladies speculated behind gloved hands. Gentlemen checked watches they did not need. The Duke was never late. His punctuality was legend, his presence anticipated like weather. Eleanor had never met him, though his name had haunted her prospects for months. Ravensmere was spoken of with reverence and restraint, a man rumored to possess both principle and power, a dangerous combination. That tonight marked the first occasion of their formal introduction had felt, to her family, like intervention. To Eleanor, it had felt like trial. She told herself she did not care whether he came. She told herself she had long since outgrown such reliance on strangers. Yet when the doors remained closed, when the minutes crept forward without his arrival, she felt something within her tighten. His absence, unintentional though it might be, was being quietly added to her list of shortcomings. At last, the orchestra began, urged into motion by the hostess's brittle smile. Couples assembled, laughter smoothing over calculation. Eleanor remained where she was. No one approached. No card was offered. The empty space around her widened, as though to ensure no confusion about her standing. She watched a young lady scarcely out of the schoolroom take the floor, cheeks flushed with triumph. Eleanor felt no envy, only a dull recognition. This was how it happened. Not with grand refusals, but with silence. With being overlooked until one learned to overlook oneself. Her mother caught her eye from across the room, worry quickly masked by pride. Eleanor answered with the smallest nod. She would endure this. She always had. The world could not humiliate her if she refused to bend. Then, at the precise moment her resolve settled into resignation, the great doors at the far end of the ballroom stared. Conversation faltered. Heads turned in unison. A footman stepped forward, breathless, his voice rising to announce the arrival so long delayed. The Duke of Ravensmere had come at last. A ripple moved through the assembly, sharp as a blade through silk. Eleanor felt it before she understood it, that collective intake of breath which precedes admiration or disaster. She did not turn at once. Pride held her still, yet curiosity urged her to look, if only to confirm that this moment, too, would pass her by. When she finally shifted her gaze, she saw first the Duke's height, the authority of his bearing, rain-darkened hair brushed back as though time itself had failed to discipline him. His presence altered the room, drawing attention away from its smaller cruelties towards something larger. Then she saw the figure at his side, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched. Whispers resumed, faster now, sharpened with delight. Eleanor could not hear their words, but she felt their direction change, like when seeking a new weakness. She sensed the night had shifted its intention. For an instant, the Duke's gaze lifted, scanning the room with an expression neither apologetic nor deferential. It paused, briefly, inexplicably, upon Eleanor's solitary figure. There was no pity in it, no dismissal. Before she could examine the thought, the room closed in again, murmurs swelling, judgment rearranging itself around this new provocation. Eleanor drew a careful breath. Shame had brought her here, but anticipation stirred beneath it. Whatever the Duke had carried through those doors would not leave her untouched. The Duke did not pause to allow the room its indulgence. He moved forward with measured strides, boots still bearing the faint sheen of rain, as though he had carried the weather in with him on purpose. At his side walked a young woman cloaked in dove gray, her bonnet drawn low, her gloved hand resting lightly upon his arm. She was not introduced. That omission alone was enough to sharpen every whisper into accusation. Eleanor felt the collective gaze slide from the Duke to his companion, and then, with alarming inevitability, toward herself. Proximity, however imagined, was a crime in such rooms. She stood unmoving, pole steady by long habit, while conjecture bloomed like mold upon damp walls. A mistress, some murmured. A ward, others speculated, though the Duke was known for neither sentimentality nor charity. Whatever the truth, it had arrived uninvited and unmistakably alive. The hostess advanced, lips tightened into civility, and greeted the Duke with a curtsy too shallow to conceal displeasure. He bowed in return, impeccable, unhurried. When she addressed his companion, there was the faintest hesitation, as though language itself had faltered. The young woman inclined her head but offered no name. Her silence was deliberate, Eleanor thought, and disciplined. Music resumed, though it carried an edge now, strings strained by curiosity. The Duke guided his companion to the edge of the floor and murmured something Eleanor could not hear. The woman released his arm and stepped aside, positioning herself near the wall, half-shadowed by a palm. She looked neither frightened nor bold. She looked prepared. That was when the Duke turned fully toward Eleanor. It was not an impulsive motion. He took in the room first, the careful cruelty of its arrangements, the spaces designed to exclude. Then he crossed the distance between them, each step a quiet disruption. Eleanor felt the sudden heat of attention, the way expectation sharpened into something almost painful. When he stopped before her, the space around her altered, no longer empty but charged. "Miss Hartwell," he said, her name spoken clearly, as though it had never been reduced to a murmur. His voice was lower than she expected, steady and unadorned. "I hope you will forgive my delay." She inclined her head, meeting his gaze without apology. His eyes were a deep, thoughtful gray, observant rather than indulgent. "I'm certain the evening has forgiven you already, Your Grace." A flicker passed through his expression, something like amusement tempered by restraint. He extended his hand. The gesture was unexceptional, and yet it drew breath from the room. "May I have the honor of this dance?" Eleanor hesitated only long enough to recognize the magnitude of refusal. To accept would bind her to whatever scandal clung to him. To decline would confirm every whispered judgment. She placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was firm, respectful, warm. As they moved onto the floor, conversation stuttered and then surged. Eleanor felt it crest behind her like a wave. breaking into fragments of speculation. The Duke led with practiced ease, his attention fixed upon her as though no other presence competed. She matched his steps, the dance unfolding with graceful inevitability. "You are very calm," he observed quietly. "I have had practice," she replied. His mouth curved slightly. "Then perhaps tonight we shall both be tested." They danced beneath the chandeliers, light scattering across polished floors, and Eleanor became acutely aware of the scrutiny pressed upon her back. She could almost feel her reputation shifting, reshaping itself around this single, daring act. The Duke spoke sparingly, yet each word seemed chosen to anchor rather than dazzle. He asked about her reading, her travels, her opinions. Not once did he inquire after her misfortunes. When the music ended, applause followed, polite but strained. The Duke did not release her at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, passing it into her palm with practiced discretion. It was a cameo brooch, ivory and silver, the profile of a woman carved with solemn beauty. Eleanor recognized the craftsmanship immediately. It was old and valuable. "A token," he said softly. "Returned, not given. It belonged to my mother, and she believed it should find its way to you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Your Grace, this is quite impossible." "On the contrary," he replied, his gaze steady. "It is necessary." He bowed and stepped away before she could protest, leaving her standing with the weight of the brooch and the room's astonishment. Eyes followed him as he crossed to his companion, offering his arm once more. This time, as they stood together, he spoke loudly enough to be overheard. "My sister has been too long without proper introduction," he said. "I intend to remedy that." The words struck like a bell. Whispers shifted shape, rearranging themselves into new astonishment. Eleanor looked down at the brooch in her hand, understanding dawning too late to protect her from its consequences. Association had already been declared, and truth, however noble, did not arrive without cost. Across the room, the Duke glanced back once, his expression unreadable, as the first truly dangerous rumor took flight. Eleanor felt the weight of that glance linger long after he turned away, as if he had marked her not as collateral, but as consequence. Around her, the ballroom adjusted its posture, recalculating alliances with ruthless speed. A matron's smile cooled, a gentleman's bow became speculative. Even her mother's face, pale across the room, reflected both fear and awe at the audacity just displayed. The brooch seemed to warm against Eleanor's skin, an inheritance she had not sought yet could not refuse. She sensed that the evening had crossed a threshold from which retreat was impossible, and that whatever mercy truth might offer would arrive far too late to spare her name. Somewhere behind the music, fate leaned closer, listening, and Eleanor understood that the Duke's unexpected company was only the first revelation meant to undo her carefully practiced silence. Eleanor did not intend to seek him out. Intention, she had learned, was a luxury for those whose names were not already bent beneath suspicion. Yet when the ballroom's heat became unbearable, when the brooch at her breast felt less like ornament than accusation, she allowed her steps to drift toward the quieter corridors beyond the music. It was there, amid tall windows veiled in night and the hush of unused rooms, that she found herself no longer alone. The Duke stood near a writing table, his back to the door, one hand braced against polished wood as though the evening required steadiness. He turned at the sound of her approach, surprise softening quickly into recognition. The noise of the ballroom reached them only as a distant pulse, like blood heard through walls. "I feared you would avoid me," he said. "I feared I should not," Eleanor replied, and surprised herself with the honesty of it. For a moment, neither moved. The candles along the walls cast long shadows, exaggerating the space between them, turning restraint into a visible thing. Eleanor's pulse, so disciplined under scrutiny, betrayed her now. She lifted her chin. "Your Grace, you have placed me in an impossible position." He inclined his head, acknowledging the charge without defense. "I am aware. I would not have done so lightly." "Lightness does not concern me," she said. "Consequences do." He studied her, as awaiting not her words, but the cost they carried. Then allow me to speak plainly, if only he. She nodded once. My sister arrived in London today, he said, unexpectedly, and in distress. She fled circumstances I will not dignify with description. I was late because I went to her first. I brought her because I would not leave her unprotected, nor hidden like a shameful thing. Eleanor absorbed this in silence. It explained much, though not everything. And the brooch. His gaze dropped briefly. My mother entrusted it to me with the instruction that it should be given to the woman who reminded her that dignity could survive disappointment. She spoke your name before she died. The air seemed to thin. Eleanor felt the floor tilt, just slightly. I never met your mother. No, he said, but she observed you, as I have. She folded her hands to still their tremor. Observation can be generous or cruel. I strive for the former, he replied, though I am not always granted the luxury of outcome. Her breath escaped slowly. You must understand what your gesture implies. I do, he said quietly, and I accept it. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Men of his station accepted very little that did not save them. Why? She asked. The question bare at last. He did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to the window, drawing aside the heavy drape. Rain streaked the glass. The city beyond blurred into abstraction. Because I am tired, he said, not turning. Of rooms that feed upon weakness. Of watching capable women reduced to whispers because their fortunes do not match their worth. Eleanor felt the words strike deep, not as flattery, but recognition. You do not know me, she said softly. I know enough, he answered, and I wish to know more, if you will permit it. The request was careful, contained, yet its weight pressed upon her chest. Your permission is a dangerous thing, she said. I am already mocked. So am I, he replied, finally facing her. Difference lies only in who believes themselves untouchable. She almost smiled, but restraint held. You gamble boldly. I do not gamble, he said. I choose. Footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond, distant but approaching. Eleanor felt the moment narrowing, urgency threading through it. If this is your choice, she said, then understand mine. I will not be pitied. I will not be rescued. Nor would I attempt either, he said. I offer alliance, not charity. The footsteps drew nearer. Eleanor reached for the brooch, unclasping it and placing it upon the table between them. Then take this back, she said, until such time as the room can no longer decide my value for me. His eyes flicked to the cameo, then back to her face. Something unreadable passed between them. Very well, he said. But know this, Miss Hartwell. I do not retreat from what I place in motion. The footsteps paused, just outside the door. Eleanor felt the weight of choice settle, irrevocable. She turned to leave, then stopped. Nor do I, she said. As she slipped past the opening door, heart steady despite the storm it carried, Eleanor understood that whatever silence she had guarded so fiercely was now broken. Not by scandal, but by truth spoken too late to be harmless, and too early to be undone. The rumor did not arrive all at once, but by degrees, like smoke creeping beneath doors. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, a tightening of the air, a recalibration of glances. By the time she re-entered the ballroom, the evening had changed its posture toward her, leaning forward with expectation sharpened into appetite. The Duke stood near the dais, his sister at his side, their presence no longer novel but charged. Music stilled as the hostess rose, her smile rigid with purpose. Announcements followed, brittle and perfunctory, until at last the room was gathered in a loose semicircle, every eye angled toward Ravensmay. Eleanor found herself drawn forward by nothing she could name, her steps guided by the same gravity that had governed the night since his arrival. The Duke moved then, deliberately, stepping away from his sister and toward the center of the floor. He did not raise his voice, yet it carried, steady and unadorned, cutting through anticipation like a blade through silk. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I am aware that my conduct this evening has invited speculation. A murmur rippled, quickly stilled. I will not apologize for it, he continued. nor will I allow silence to be mistaken for consent to misjudgment. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She sensed, dimly, that the moment she had both feared and resisted had found her at last. My sister, whom I have brought among you without introduction, has been the subject of circumstances unworthy of this assembly's curiosity. She remains under my protection, and that protection is not open to debate. There it was, cleanly spoken, scandal reframed as principle. The Duke paused, letting the weight of it settle. Then his gaze lifted, seeking Eleanor without hesitation. When it found her, it held. There is another matter, he said. One that concerns Miss Eleanor Hartwell. A hush fell, deep and complete. Eleanor felt heat rise along her spine, but she did not retreat. She met his gaze, spine straight, breath measured. I'm aware of the assumptions made about her, he said. They are convenient, and they are false. A sharp intake of breath sounded somewhere to Eleanor's left. She did not turn. I have known Miss Hartwell for less than an evening, the Duke continued. Yet I know enough to say this. Her dignity does not require defense, but I offer mine in its service. The words landed with quiet force. Eleanor felt something shift, not in the room, but within herself. The Duke stepped closer, closing the distance society had carved between them. It is my intention, he said, voice unwavering, to make her an offer of formal courtship, to be conducted openly, with all due respect, and without regard for convenience. Whispers broke free, louder now, astonishment shedding its restraint. Eleanor's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. The hostess's fans stilled mid-motion. Eleanor stood as though the floor had claimed her, every instinct urging composure even as her heart raced. The Duke turned fully toward her. Miss Hartwell, he said, softly now, the room fading at the edges. Will you permit me this honor? It was not a proposal, not yet. It was something rarer, more dangerous. Choice. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze, the accumulated judgment of years pressing against her ribs. She thought of a father's quiet pride, of a mother's careful hope, of the brooch resting still upon the writing table beyond these walls. She thought of silence, and how it had served her, and how it no longer could. She stepped forward. I will, she said, her voice clear. On one condition. The Duke inclined his head, inviting it. That I remain myself, she continued. Not redeemed by your name, nor sheltered by it. I will not be reshaped to suit the comfort of others. A pause, brief but charged. Then the Duke smiled, not broadly, but with unmistakable warmth. I would not insult you by asking it. The room exhaled, though uneasily. Alliances would be tested by morning. Consequences would arrive with daylight. Eleanor felt none of it yet. Only the strange, steady certainty that she had stepped beyond endurance into agency. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then gaining strength as though encouraged by necessity rather than conviction. The Duke offered his arm. Eleanor accepted, the gesture formal, public, irrevocable. As they turned together, she caught sight of his sister watching from the edge of the floor, expression thoughtful, approving. It occurred to Eleanor then that this declaration had been less rescue than alignment, less spectacle than warning. The Duke leaned closer as they moved, his voice low. This will not be easy. I know, Eleanor replied. Nor swift. I am accustomed to patience. His gaze held hers. Then allow me to prove worthy of it. They took their place among the assembled, the night rearranging itself around them. Yet even as Eleanor stood at his side, steadied by resolve, she sensed the story was not finished. Truth had been spoken, but not all of it, and somewhere beyond the chandeliers, beyond applause and calculation, another reckoning waited, poised to test whether courage, once claimed, could truly endure. Dawn entered the city without ceremony, pale and deliberate, touching rooftops and windows as though testing whether the night's declarations would endure inspection. Eleanor woke with the sense that something irrevocable had occurred, not as dream but as decision. The world beyond the curtains felt altered, sharpened, as if it now expected more of her than quiet survival. By mid-morning, consequence arrived. Letters bearing familiar crests accumulated upon the hall table, some sealed with curiosity, others with thinly veiled warning. Eleanor read none of them. Instead, she dressed with care, choosing simplicity over armor, and waited. She did not know for what, only that waiting was no longer passive. The Duke came before noon, unannounced yet anticipated, his presence steady as ever. He did not bring flowers, nor apology. He brought truth and the weight of standing by it. They spoke in the small drawing room, where sunlight traced the worn patterns of the rug and made honesty feel unavoidable. "My sister will depart for the country tonight," he said. "Her safety is assured. The rumors will follow, but they will not catch her." "And you?" Eleanor asked. He met her gaze. "I remain." That answer carried more than reassurance. It was commitment without flourish, and she felt its gravity settle between them. Outside, carriage wheels passed, the city resuming its rhythm, indifferent yet observant. Word spread quickly. Some doors closed as predicted. Others opened with cautious respect. Eleanor found herself neither ostracized nor embraced, but observed anew, her name spoken with curiosity rather than dismissal. It was not victory, but it was movement. In the afternoon, the brooch was returned. The Duke placed it in her hand without ceremony. "Now," he said. Eleanor fastened it herself, feeling the cool certainty of choice. "Now," she agreed. Their courtship unfolded not in grand gestures, but in consistency. Walks taken without secrecy. Conversations held without apology. Each appearance together recalibrated expectation, proving that scandal, when met with steadiness, could be starved of its power. Still, doubt lingered like a final test. It came on an evening much like the first, another gathering, another room heavy with memory. A woman spoke too loudly, a man smiled too knowingly. Eleanor felt the old reflex stir, the instinct to retreat. The Duke sensed it. He did not shield her. He took her hand. "Whatever they believe," he said quietly, "will be smaller than what we know." The moment passed. The room adjusted. Eleanor remained. Weeks later, beneath a sky softened by spring, he asked her to marry him. Not before witnesses, nor with spectacle, but in a garden where new growth pressed insistently through old soil. His voice did not tremble. Hers did, once. "Yes," she said, and felt no fear follow it. Their engagement did not erase the past, but it rewrote its ending. Eleanor did not become a duchess in retreat, nor did she surrender her edges to comfort. She learned, instead, that love could be an act of alignment, not escape. On the morning of their departure from London, she stood at the window, watching the city recede as the carriage turned. The Duke sat opposite her, silent, present. She took his hand, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement. Behind them, whispers would persist. Ahead, uncertainty waited. Yet Eleanor felt no urge to look back. For the first time, the future did not require her to endure it. It invited her to choose. Their wedding was modest by design, yet its restraint drew more attention than extravagance ever could. Attendance was careful, curated by conviction rather than obligation. Those who came bore witness not merely to union, but to a recalibration of regard. Eleanor walked without tremor, not because noes were absent, but because they no longer governed her. When she spoke her vows, they were not a surrender, but a promise shared. Afterward, as bells marked the hour and the crowd dispersed, a woman approached Eleanor with hesitant grace. She offered congratulations tinged with apology, a recognition long withheld. Eleanor accepted it without triumph. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not absolution granted to others, but freedom claimed for oneself. The Duke watched this exchange with quiet pride. He had not sought to rescue her from judgment, only to stand where judgment could not isolate her. In that balance, they had found their strength. Life beyond the city unfolded with gentler rhythms. At Ravensmere, Eleanor discovered spaces where her voice carried weight, where her opinions shaped decisions rather than deflected them. She was not adorned for display, but consulted, challenged, respected. The title that followed her name neither diminished nor defined her. It accompanied her, nothing more. Yet the truest measure of change arrived in stillness. One evening, Seated by firelight, Eleanor found herself laughing freely, without calculation. The sound startled her. The Duke looked up, and she saw in his expression the quiet wonder of shared becoming. "I once believed endurance was my greatest virtue," she said. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know it was preparation." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, unburdened by judgment. Eleanor leaned into the moment, unafraid of its passing. She had been late to the world's approval, but precisely on time for her own life, and that, at last, was enough. History would not record the quieter victories, the evenings unmarked by applause, the choices made without audience. Yet in those moments, love proved itself most radical, not as spectacle, but as persistence. Eleanor understood then that society's cruelty thrived on silence, and that her voice, once claimed, would never again be borrowed. As the fire dimmed and night settled into peace, she rested within that certainty, knowing that what had begun in shame had ended not in triumph, but in truth, steady and unafraid. It was a truth that asked nothing, promised nothing extravagant, and yet offered her the rarest gift of all, to be seen and to remain. In that seeing, she finally recognized herself, whole, unbroken, and entirely her own, forever.